today we'll be talking about the world as we know it and how we as living, perceiving beings experience that world. But I think that's also just the beginning of a much larger conversation, which I look forward to having right now. So can we invite the panel up, please? I think that one of the things I find striking about the commonalities in this panel is the convergence between this idea of the perceptual gestalt and then the sort of sensory convergence that you have worked on, Kingson. Can you guys talk about that a little bit? I mean, should we be thinking about senses as being fundamentally entangled, and then how do we design for that?
I'd just like to respond. Without a doubt, they must be fundamentally entangled, because I'm interested in consciousness. I'm interested in experience. Experience is not isolated, even though the parts of the brain are. And the history of neuroscience is tangled up in the history of vision research and vision alone. Mm-hmm. We figured out how neurons even work through visual experiments in like cat retina or things like that. So we come from a place where we study the single particular sense because we're still so young in our understanding of the brain. Mm-hmm. But if we want to ever get to technology that is absorbing, that we have to abandon this unisensory approach. We have to take a look at how humans actually have experiences, how it is bound together. And this is a huge philosophical and scientific problem, the binding problem of consciousness. We just don't know. It's a huge mystery still.
Yeah, and I wanted to point out, for those of us in the room, how many people are content developers? Okay, and then how about platform developers, back end? Okay, so, we've got an audience that's creating experiences that are meant to be immersive, and you could say entertaining, theatrical. And if we stop and ask ourselves about why would we privilege looking only at one, the scientific method finds that very helpful as a procedural process. But our experiences are not one unless we've had brain damage of some, severe brain damage of sort. So we're talking about combinatorial experiences because, in fact, our trade is that of creating experiences that are gestalt, as Jacki's pointed out. What I wanted to raise for us in this question you ask about combinatorial is the role that movement plays. This is a question that plagued me in dance. It's a question that dancers worry about in their place in the history of arts, particularly in relationship to theater, which was language-based. And movement is, as we're learning, is a sense that can't help but be combinatorial. Yeah? So I guess, Clara, I would ask the question, is your question about what are we gaining by researching combinatorial or creating combinatorial experiences, or what is lost if we don't?
Well, I mean, you can feel free to answer any of those questions. They're all interesting. I mean, I think what I'm asking really is that, if we take as a given that we exist on this kind of perceptual gradient where all our senses are bleeding into one another on some level, how do we simulate and replicate that experience on a content side?
That's the question of the hour, I think, and that's the one I hope that if you go away with nothing else from this event, that's something you start to think about. Because VR is our first medium that is fully embodied, that we can actually put our entire body into this experience in a way we've never really been able to do. Some part of us has always been outside the experience, sort of our meta-consciousness as we watch a film or we watch a play or we watch anything or we hear a symphony. We still know that part of us is not really integrated into that medium. And with VR, it's a whole new story. So we have to create content that takes advantage of those affordances of VR that allow us to put our entire body into something, and it's a whole new world. I think somebody had that on their slide, and I think that that's the challenge. That's the biggest challenge of VR.
Selwa? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Can I switch mics? Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I came across an interesting way of framing VR as, I think Jérôme Lanier called it the last medium or post-symbolic communication. And I've been thinking about that in terms of simulating the senses, but also in conversation with other content creators, what verbs we can replace with the word simulate when it comes to the senses. And I think all of us, again, are engaging with this, whether we're augmenting, whether we're expanding the sense itself. I think that, to me, is a really exciting speculative question to be asking. But I also think it's really interesting because it relates to something Kingson mentioned about the architecture of the senses, and coming from the perspective of a designer, I feel that's a stimulating moment of inspiration to start thinking about, well, if we're working with all of the senses, how are we starting to architect them to be working together beyond simulation?
One of the things that you showed in your slide, Selwa, was the fact that Selwa worked with dancers and chose them particularly because they have a movement language and a spoken language of moving in space. So what I'd like to add to this discussion is that space is left out of the discussion, spatial sensing. It's not the same thing as kinesthesia per se. Spatial sensing is actually not a sense, it's a map, yeah? And the research on spatial memory can help us understand that we grow cognitive maps through experiences of moving and hearing and smelling and tasting in space. So perhaps what we have to add to our argument, vis-a-vis the language of architecture, is that we want to begin to ask these questions about experience in space. It happens to be virtual space. Mais il n'y a pas de quoi. Yeah? It's spatial. Can we begin there?
I'd like to follow up with that because space is the mother sense, that the fact that there is a world of extension outside of your body is the original sense. There's a fascinating philosophical problem which a scientific study answered, which is if you have a blind person who can hear and they understand that they can hear the whizzing of a ball as it's thrown to them, they can catch it. What happens when sight is restored to them?
Yes.
Will they know? Will they see it coming and be able to grab it? Do they have a sense of space that transfers from auditory to visual? This study was just published a few years ago, and they answered this is like a 1,000-year-old philosophy puzzle.
Right.
That they did the experiment, it works. We do have a basic, fundamental mother sense of space out there.
And we have space also inside, so interception, the ability to sense when we're hungry, the sense when we have pain. And Jacki, you pointed to the question of gut response. Yeah. So the language of space could be very helpful to us. And what Nels and I were trying to work on in the class was particularly this question, which was reading a story, because we started with a story written, if that could be translated then into drawing a character that had a movement motif. Students started it in Maya, brought it then into Unity, but as soon as they slapped on the mask, it transformed how they began to think about working their design. It was the mask. It was the moving through a 3D body schema that changed the way they began to really imagine the possibility of moving in space and designing for spatial experiences.
One of the best examples of this is the tilt brush application. So how many of you have tried the tilt brush application? Isn't it amazing? I mean, even people that are not necessarily artistic don't come out for hours. My husband was one. I had to call him for dinner because he just got so involved with drawing in that. It is such an intuitive mechanism for interacting with space in an embodied way. And I hope we see a lot more things like this coming out of VR.
Talking about space, place, and context, how does recentering in these traditionally less privileged senses in the realm of VR, how does that help us to reconnect to the natural world? I mean, do smell, taste, and touch, do they anchor us or root us on the planet?
Well, I think so. I mean, I think it's definitely something that I think we need more work on. We need to see how natural world spaces affect us, because I think it's even beyond the gestalt of sensory experience. There's more stuff there that makes the world important to us as human beings. And that's what I said about digitizing the intangible. I think if we can figure out why a particular space, say the Sacred Well in Ireland, affects us, then, and maybe we need some field work, talk to the people who've been there, use other measuring devices to see if there's other emanations coming from there, or there's so many things we can do. So this is a project I've proposed to the European Union so that we can really try and figure out if there is something above just basic sight, sound, and smell that can help really recreate places of the earth that can give us a sacred sense, if you will.
I see a little bit of that in the image, Kingson, that you showed of the many different perceptual modes overlapping with one another. This sense maybe that there are spaces between senses, perhaps. Is that something that you would say is true? Could we use VR to help us identify places where there's a purple in between the colors, if you will?
Yeah, so these maps are published and they're available open source. And you can map a specific experience or a specific merge of senses, and you can target that. For example, there may be a more emotive, a region that's closer to emotive regions, such as the insula, to bring it out there. Or there may be some memory regions that you want to target instead, and specific combinations of senses may better target whatever effect you're trying to achieve. I also want to make contact with the previous question about these environmental implications of sensory substitution, and can it increase our appreciation for the environment? Or, on the other hand, I'd like to bring up that can it become an escape from the environment? Why do we want to replicate watching a sunset on a beach when we can drive down the 10? And sure, we can
travel down the 10.
Well, we can democratize these experiences. Yeah. That could be an impediment, but are there points to impediment? Are there points to difficulty and for isolating certain geographic situated experiences that we don't want to replicate? Are we going too far in replicating certain experiences?
So Kingston, isn't it unfair for those of us living in Southern California to deny people living in the winter of Oklahoma, snowbound, to not have an experience of the ocean?
That's an excellent question. And ultimately, do we, are we creating this new, extremely powerful and addictive technology that we don't have the capability to restrain or restrict ourselves from? Once the person in Oklahoma can spend the winter at the beach in VR, why wouldn't they?
Who's going to feed the cows?
Real estate prices go up in Southern California, right? They all move to the beach.
But that begs the question, if you don't want to just recreate something that could be done in your physical existence, however remote the possibility you might get to someplace like Easter Island or whatever, what do you add? What is the specialness that you add that would bring someone to an experience that could only be had in virtual reality? So I think that's a good question, too. I mean, we see a lot of VR films that are taking you to a particular location in the world, and I question how much of an experience is that, because really all you can do is kind of look around. Is that really bringing us to the beach without the 10?
Well, if I could, I want to ask my colleague Nels to speak about the project that he introduced me to when I first met him, that dealt with the question of buoyancy. Nels, would you be willing to take that on?
I don't think you know as much as I do.
Okay. So Nels, when I first met Nels, he asked me, he said, well, in virtual reality, what's so exciting, particularly in game worlds, wearing virtual, you can actually fly. Yeah, through avatars, you can fly. We can't yet, right, with our own bodies, unless you're a hang glider. And so we developed actually a research project working with a neuroscientist from UC Irvine who's a satellite member of ours in our company and who's working with VR and game worlds to understand spatial memory. So we propose to look at buoyancy as a factor, to go to the point of looking at something that we don't experience, Jacki. To look at buoyancy, the ability to create experiences that our bipedal bodies, restricted by a gravitational field, cannot have. And buoyancy would be one which is you feel yourself floating in space, the way you might feel floating in water. So perhaps maybe we begin to look at experiences that are fantastical, that can borrow on real-time gravitational experiences.
I think pulling out of that, and maybe I think this is a good segue, how can we design VR experiences that don't just simulate or mimic our senses, but allow us to improve them, perhaps? I mean, can we use VR to train ourselves to smell better, to feel more deeply?
Allow me to answer that in light of VR research going on in the clinical sphere that is particularly interested in that very question. Training people to, go back to the phantom limb research, which wasn't really wearing a mask per se, but Ramachandran was interested in looking at how people who had experienced phantom limb how that could be the case. And there you actually have the exception to the rule, and by looking at the exception, which is the injury of the denial of the inability to see or hear, that we begin to get a lot more data of understanding how adaptivity occurs, particularly adaptivity, I think. Wouldn't you think, Kingston, adaptivity, when there's something, a sense is lost, how the brain, in a kind of a neuro-Darwinian sense, begins to act and adapt?
That's an interesting use case, and I think you're talking about brain training with this to augment more standard therapy.
Yes.
And yes, I think it is a fantastical aspect of VR that I think is the most powerful, rather than just the merely depictive, or you just want to reproduce experiences. And there are therapeutic uses that can go beyond the best therapist alive. I mean, a VR agent can listen forever, right?
Right,
You don't have to say time's up.
Right, and at the Institute at USC, the whole PTSD work, right, with
Skip Rizzo.
Skip Rizzo, yeah.
Yeah, there's I mean, first of all, VR was originally set up to be a training mechanism to do things that would have otherwise be too dangerous or too costly. So it has a long history in that. And I think the therapy has been in continuous practical use all the time we've had VR. Even when it was very expensive, we were still doing a lot of research into those applications. The question I kind of teased out of what you all were saying was, would it be cool to have VR allow us to exercise some aspect of brain plasticity to restore senses or aspects of memory or whatever it is that we are losing for some reason? Is it a possibility to have it pressed into that service? And I think that would be, barring neural implants, that might be a good use for it.
Well, certainly in the area of spinal cord injury, that's a direction that's actually being explored.
Stroke as well.
Yes.
Stroke rehabilitation. You imitate what the agent is doing, and they can take you through constant exercises in a way that a therapist just cannot.
Right. And they don't get tired, as you said.
Right.
Well, continuing along the lines of training, though this doesn't have to do with healing per se, but the people of northern Thailand, the Jahai people, have been found to have the most sophisticated language when it comes to smell. And because of this, they also have the most, as a whole, the most sophisticated cultural discourse and ability to discern smell. So I would think that on a just practical level, perhaps a virtual reality experience with smell could, again, improve smell discourse and smell literacy, something I mentioned in my presentation. But then it leads me to sort of a tangential question, which I'm curious, maybe Jacki has a thought on this, which is related to the difference between haptics, smell, and haptics, smell, and taste, is that with smell, and I think taste, in creating these virtual experiences, you're reliant on these scent objects. And as Jacki mentioned, there's a handful of conglomerates that basically own these proprietary databases of smell. So as a creator, as a designer, if I do want to create some sort of experience that has a very complex breadth of scents, that includes abstract scents. For example, coffee contains 400 scent molecules. And if I want to start creating experiences that abstract some of the daily scent experiences we might have, I'm dependent on sourcing these scent objects and finding ways to do that. And right now, there's a very big difference, I think, from a creator's perspective in terms of being able to source visuals and auditory experience or make haptic experiences versus being able to actually source the materials you need or have access to the database to work with these scent objects.
Well, I'll just say this about that. We live in a great time for both the democratization of VR and the democratization of scent design. When I did my scent collar, it was true. Everything was locked up, and I was talking to the head research scientist at IFF, and he was very interested in working with me so we could take this headspace machine out and we could get the smells from the Bosnian countryside and we could do everything you want. And then I called him back and said, so when are we going? And he's like, my bosses said, no, we're not doing anything with that. But today, there are people that are teaching scent design. And right here in Los Angeles, we have the Institute for Art and Olfaction that was started by Saskia Wilson Brown. She gives classes. There's lots of classes every month where you can go learn the basics of scent design and what odors. I mean, it's very complicated. It would take you years to get to a master level of creating these things, but you can do it yourself now, and she shares all the information, and I just applaud her for this work, because until her institute was started, we did not have many independent scent designers, and now we have lots of them all over the world. And these are the people that you can work with to create scents for your virtual reality. And there may be some that are in databases, you know, in some warehouse in France, whatever, that they might come after you with a patent on. I don't know. I don't think it's that tied up. But you know, if you wanted to recreate Chanel No. 5, yes, they'd come after you. But if you want to recreate the scent of, you know, your firstborn child when you take them out in the grass the first time, I don't think they can patent that.
This reminds me of perfumiers I met in India. And perhaps maybe one of the challenges we have with smell is that we just don't have the industry developed because it isn't within, certainly it is, as we're talking about, it's not within our cultural context. But if you go to India, forgive me, I walked into a perfumier and the man stops and he said, stop, come here, and I want you to pick your scent, but don't tell me. So my colleagues and I, we each picked our scent, and he said, I'm gonna choose it. I'm gonna choose it, and you let me know if I'm right. And damn, he chose the 3 scents, absolutely right. And he said, and we said, well, how did you do that? He places his hand on the table, and he says, what's different about my hand? And we're looking, well, you know, the skin and the muscles are so well developed, or your fingers are so long. He said, no, I have 6 fingers. And then he lifts his leg, and I have 6 toes on each foot. And that's why I can pick your scent.
Did he really have 6 fingers?
He did. He had 6 fingers.
And you missed that?
We missed it. And so we missed it.
Talk about perception.
We missed it for a basic brain mechanism, like really, because the brain expects to see 5, not 6, right? And I tell this story because really we're talking about the cultural denial. There are cultures that are so rich in this discussion, right? And have a long tradition of specificity without adding agents of alcohol, et cetera. So perhaps maybe we need to travel more.
How can literacy in these matters, a knowledge and understanding of smell, touch, taste, help us to create VR experiences that allow us to perceive things that are not ordinarily perceived. For example, synesthesia, or how animals perceive the world. Is that something that any of you guys are interested in?
I think those are great areas. I love the one where you're seeing as other creatures would see. Synesthesia, that one seems pretty easy, but yeah, I'm less excited about that. I know a lot of artists are very interested in that. But I think extending our perceptions in ways that are not part of our everyday life. I mean, I think this is a great path for VR in so many ways, for seeing as an animal sees, for seeing as an other sees, that whole empathy idea. There are possibilities for that. I'm not sure that we're there yet in the kind of VR we have right now, but I think there are possibilities for giving us opportunities that we don't have in our everyday life, like the buoyancy thing, as you mentioned. I would love to figure out how we can do zero gravity in VR. I don't think it's quite possible yet, but NASA puts their astronauts in a pool, so that's how they do it. So as we figure out more things, maybe we will be able to extend the human experience. And then you can light up new brain areas, and we get better pictures.
We can get to experiences that have never been experienced before, that were not yet possible before, and then we get into the speculative realm of, the sky's the limit, and we see previews of this in current science fiction, which is such a fertile area that is where we can get inspiration from. What are the experiences that the new novel experience that we can design rather than copying current ones and distributing them. I also wanted to connect with Selwa on I think her final phase showed the neuroprosthetic phase, which is where we ultimately will, I believe, need to get to do a sophisticated, mature scent prosthetics. We need to just jack directly into the brain because, as you say, the materials to build the sense are themselves proprietary and tightly locked down. And we're making inroads along that way. You can just record neural activity from the fibers and then play it right back. And we're doing that with vision, for example. We can do things such as transcranial magnetic stimulation, where you put these magnet pulses into your visual cortex for now, and you can send little designs, and you'll see little sparkles of whatever design you're sending into your visual cortex. So we got to get that direct feed into the brain, because that is ultimately what produces your experience. And we can't forget about the input from the body, but the brain takes it all in.
Do we know enough to be able to do that with smell?
Absolutely not.
Yet. Not yet.